A young couple from Florida packed up their lives and moved to Texas in 1980 with their infant daughter, chasing a new opportunity. Within weeks, they had vanished. Their bodies would not be found for months, and when they were, nobody knew who they were. Their baby daughter disappeared entirely, and two families spent the next 4 decades searching for answers that seemed impossible to find. This is a case that spans multiple states, involves a mysterious religious group, and ends with a discovery that investigators never expected. For 40 years, 2 unidentified bodies lay in a Houston grave while a little girl grew up somewhere in America not knowing her real name. And when the truth finally came, it arrived not through a confession or a witness, but through science that did not exist when the crime was committed. If you want to follow cases like this one, where the truth takes decades to surface, hit that subscribe button right now. Harold Dean Clouse Jr. was 21 years old when he and his 17-year-old wife, Tina Gail Lynn Clouse, left their home state of Florida in 1980. The young couple had a 1-year-old daughter named Holly Marie Clouse. Harold had received what appeared to be a promising work opportunity in Texas, and the family made the decision to relocate from Florida to pursue it. The move took them far from their extended families on both sides. The Clouse family settled in Lewisville, Texas, a city north of Dallas. The young couple was establishing themselves in a new state, adjusting to their surroundings while caring for their infant daughter. Harold and Tina maintained contact with their respective families back in Florida during the early weeks of their time in Texas, keeping relatives informed about their situation and progress. The last documented contact between Harold and Tina and their families occurred in late October 1980. During that final communication, the couple was living in Lewisville and had not indicated any plans to leave Texas or make significant changes to their circumstances. The conversation gave no indication that anything was wrong or that the family was in any danger. After that late October contact, Harold and Tina went completely silent. Their families in Florida waited for calls that never came. Days turned into weeks without any word from Harold, Tina, or any indication of where the young family had gone. The silence was uncharacteristic and deeply concerning to relatives who had been in regular contact with the couple since their move to Texas. The absence of communication from both Harold and Tina simultaneously made the situation more alarming than a simple lapse in contact might otherwise suggest. Families on both sides attempted to reach the couple through whatever means were available. They tried contacting people in the Lewisville area who might have known Harold and Tina. They waited for any sign that the couple and their daughter were safe and simply busy with their new life in Texas. None of those efforts produced any response or confirmation that the family was well. As weeks passed without contact, the concern among family members deepened. Harold and Tina had left Florida with their infant daughter to build a new life, and now all 3 had seemingly vanished without explanation. The families had no way of knowing at that point what had happened, where the couple had gone, or what had become of baby Holly. The uncertainty would stretch far beyond those initial weeks of silence, growing into a mystery that would consume decades of their lives. In late December 1980 or early January 1981, the silence from Harold and Tina was broken, but not by the couple themselves. A woman contacted the Clouse and Lynn families by telephone, identifying herself only as Sister Susan. The call came weeks after the families had last heard from Harold and Tina, and the explanation offered by this unknown woman raised more questions than it answered. Sister Susan told the families that Harold and Tina had joined a nomadic religious group. According to the caller, the couple had made a deliberate decision to cut off all ties with their families and commit themselves fully to this group. The woman said the couple wanted to give up all of their possessions as part of their new commitment. As part of that process, Sister Susan said the group was willing to return the couple's car to their family in Florida. The car in question was a red 1978 AMC Concorde that belonged to Harold and Tina. Sister Susan indicated the group would return the vehicle, but asked for money in exchange for transporting it back to Florida. The request for payment in exchange for returning the couple's own property struck investigators and family members as an unusual arrangement, though in the immediate shock of the call, it may have seemed like a practical matter of covering travel costs. The families agreed to meet the woman. A location was arranged at Daytona International Speedway in Florida. Family members showed up at the agreed location along with police, unwilling to meet the strangers without law enforcement present. The group that arrived to hand over the car consisted of 2 to 3 women and possibly 1 male. The women were wearing robes and presented themselves as members of the same religious group that Sister Susan had described in the phone call. Police who were present at the Daytona meeting reportedly took the women into custody. However, investigators working the case decades later discovered that no police report from that encounter could be located. Given the age of the case, the absence of documentation was not entirely surprising, but it represented a critical gap in the investigative record. The identities of the women at Daytona, including the woman who had called as Sister Susan, remained completely unknown. The red AMC Concorde was confirmed to be the couple's vehicle. Texas authorities would later conclude that Harold and Tina were murdered in December 1980 or early January 1981. Meaning the car was handed over around the time of or shortly after their deaths. The timeline of the car return placed the religious group in proximity to events surrounding the couple's disappearance. The nomadic group that Sister Susan described had reportedly been observed across multiple states. Authorities noted the group had been seen in Arizona, California, and possibly Texas. The women at Daytona wore robes and went barefoot, consistent with descriptions of the group provided in other contexts. They reportedly ate only vegetables and rejected the use of leather products. The group appeared to operate outside mainstream society, moving between locations without fixed addresses or conventional community ties. No name was ever provided for the religious group, either by Sister Susan during the phone call or by the women at the Daytona meeting. The group's identity remained unknown to investigators working the case. The characteristics described, including the robes, barefoot appearance, vegetarian practices, and nomadic lifestyle, provided some details but were not sufficient to identify any specific organization or leadership structure. The families were left holding the returned car and a story that could not be verified. Harold and Tina had not called themselves. Their own voices had not confirmed any of what Sister Susan claimed. The families had only the word of a stranger in robes that the young couple had willingly abandoned their former lives, including their infant daughter, Holly. On January 12, 1981, searchers working with a dog located 2 bodies in a wooded area off Wallaceville Road in Harris County, Houston, Texas. The discovery came roughly 2 months after Harold and Tina had last spoken to their families in Florida. Based on the condition of the remains, investigators determined the couple had been dead for nearly that entire period, meaning they had been killed sometime in December 1980 or early January 1981. The manner in which the 2 had died indicated deliberate violence directed at both individuals. Harold Dean Clouse Jr. had been beaten, bound, and gagged. Tina Gail Lynn Clouse had been strangled. The nature of the deaths ruled out any possibility of accident or self-harm. 2 people had been killed separately, and their bodies left in a wooded location outside the city, far from the Louisville address where the couple had last been living. Harris County investigators processed the scene and documented the physical evidence available. The bodies were transported to the medical examiner's office for autopsy. Cause of death was established for both individuals. What investigators could not immediately establish was who these 2 people were. The bodies arrived at the medical examiner's office without identification, and nothing at the scene provided a clear link to any known missing persons case. The infant daughter, Holly Marie Clouse, was not found anywhere near the location. There was no trace of the baby at the scene, no clothing, no belongings, nothing to indicate a child had been present. The complete absence of any evidence relating to Holly raised an immediate and serious question that investigators had no answer for. A young couple had been killed and left in the woods, and their baby was simply not there. Harris County authorities opened a double murder investigation. Detectives worked to identify the 2 victims through available means. In 1981, the tools available for identifying unknown remains were significantly limited compared to later decades. Fingerprint databases were not as comprehensive, DNA identification technology did not yet exist in forensic practice, and the process of matching unidentified remains to missing persons reports depended heavily on physical descriptions, dental records, and circumstantial connections. Despite investigative efforts, the two bodies remained unidentified. They were cataloged as John Doe and Jane Doe in Harris County records. The case remained open, but without the foundational piece of information that any murder investigation requires, which was the identity of the victims. Without knowing who the two people were, detectives had no starting point for establishing connections, relationships, or potential suspects. The families of Harold and Tina in Florida had no knowledge of the discovery in Houston. There was no mechanism in 1981 to automatically connect an unidentified body in Texas to a missing persons concern reported in Florida. The Clouse and Lynn families continued waiting for word about Harold, Tina, and baby Holly, unaware that two of the three people they were searching for had already been found in a wooded area outside Houston. The double murder in Harris County sat in official records as an unsolved case involving two unidentified victims. Investigators had documented the crime scene, established cause of death, and preserved whatever physical evidence was available. What they lacked was the ability to move the investigation forward without knowing who the victims were. The case entered a state of suspension, maintained in files but unable to progress until the identity question could somehow be resolved. At some point following the murders of Harold and Tina, two women arrived at a church in Arizona carrying an infant. The women were barefoot and dressed in white robes. They identified themselves as members of a nomadic religious group and presented the child to church staff. The baby was Holly Marie Clouse, though at that point nobody at the church knew her name, her origins, or what had happened to the people who had brought her into the world. The women who dropped Holly off told church staff they were part of a group that lived outside conventional society. They ate only vegetables, rejected leather products, and had no fixed location. The group moved between states, maintaining no permanent community ties or address. The women mentioned to church staff that they had given up a baby on a previous occasion as well, leaving an infant at a laundromat at some earlier point. The detail was noted but not immediately actionable for the church or for investigators who would later learn of it. The women left Holly at the church and departed. No legal documentation accompanied the child, no birth records, no identifying paperwork, no information about her biological parents. The church was left with an infant whose background was entirely unknown. Holly was subsequently placed with a family who raised her as their own. Texas authorities confirmed decades later that the family who raised Holly had no involvement in the crimes committed against her biological parents and were not considered suspects in the investigation. Holly grew up without knowing the identity of her biological parents or the circumstances under which she had been separated from them. The family that raised her provided her upbringing, but the fundamental questions of where she came from and who her parents were remained unanswered throughout her childhood and into her adult years. The absence of that information was not a matter of records being lost or inaccessible. It was a consequence of the manner in which she had been handed over, with no documentation and no connection to any official system that might have linked her to the Clouse or Lynn families. The nomadic religious group that the women referenced was never formally identified by investigators. No name was provided at the time Holly was dropped off, and no subsequent investigation succeeded in establishing the precise identity or organizational structure of the group. Authorities noted the group had been observed in Arizona, California, and possibly Texas, but the absence of fixed locations, formal membership records, or any institutional presence made tracing the group extremely difficult. The woman who had called the Clouse and Lynn families as Sister Susan, the women at the Daytona meeting, and the women who dropped Holly at the Arizona church were all connected through the same described group. Whether the same individuals were present at each of those events was never established. The group remained a collection of described characteristics without confirmed identities, leaving a significant gap in the documented record of what happened to Harold, Tina, and their daughter in the months surrounding their deaths. The two bodies recovered from the wooded area off Wallaceville Road remained in Harris County records as unidentified for 40 years. The John Doe and Jane Doe designations that had been assigned in 1981 stayed attached to the case as decades passed without a match to any missing persons report. The murder investigation could not move forward in any meaningful direction without first establishing who the victims were, and that question remained open year after year. The Clouse and Lynn families in Florida spent those same decades without answers. Harold and Tina had vanished in late 1980, and beyond the strange phone call from Sister Susan and the car return at Daytona, the families had received nothing further. There was no confirmed sighting of the couple, no letter, no contact of any kind that could be verified as genuinely coming from Harold or Tina. The families were left to carry uncertainty that had no resolution in sight. The limitations of forensic technology during the 1980s and 1990s created a structural barrier to identifying the remains. DNA profiling as a forensic tool was not widely available in criminal investigations until the late 1980s, and even as it became more common, the process of using DNA to identify unknown remains required reference samples from biological relatives and access to databases that grew gradually over time. Cold cases involving unidentified victims depended heavily on those expanding capabilities, but matching any specific set of remains to a specific family required someone to make a connection between the two. The Harris County case was not the only unidentified remains case in the country. Thousands of people across the United States were buried or held in medical examiner offices without confirmed identities, and the systems for matching those individuals to missing persons reports were inconsistent and fragmented across different jurisdictions. A family searching in Florida had no guaranteed pathway to a set of unidentified remains in a Texas county database, particularly in an era before centralized national registries became operational. As the years moved into the 2000s and then the 2010s, advances in DNA technology and the growth of genetic databases gradually improved the prospects for resolving long-standing unidentified remains cases. The expansion of platforms where people voluntarily submitted DNA for genealogical research created new possibilities that had not existed when Harold and Tina were killed. These developments changed what was possible for cold cases that traditional investigative methods had been unable to resolve. The Clouse and Lynn families continued to search for information about Harold, Tina, and Holly during these decades. The passage of time did not eliminate the need for answers. Extended family members who had known the young couple maintained awareness of their disappearance and held on to the hope that at some point the questions surrounding the family would be addressed. The 40-year gap between the murders and the eventual identification of the victims reflected both the limitations of earlier forensic capabilities and the persistence required to keep old cases alive long enough for new tools to reach them. In 2021, 40 years after two unidentified bodies were recovered from a wooded area in Harris County, a combination of institutional decision-making, private funding, and forensic genealogy expertise finally produced the breakthrough that traditional investigative methods had never achieved. The path to identification began when AudioChuck, a company that produces true crime podcasts, agreed to fund the genealogical research needed to attempt an identification of the two Jane and John Doe remains from the 1981 Houston case. The funding allowed investigators to pursue a scientific approach that had not been available when the bodies were first discovered. Dr. Jennifer Love, the forensic anthropology director of the identification unit at the Harris County Medical Examiner's Office, conducted the exhumation of the remains. The purpose of the exhumation was to extract DNA samples in a condition suitable for modern genetic analysis. The preserved remains, held in Harris County for 4 decades, needed to yield usable genetic material before any genealogical comparison could take place. The extracted DNA was handed to Identifinders International, a forensic genealogy firm with experience working on cold cases involving unidentified remains. The lead genealogist assigned to the case was Misty Gillis, a senior forensic genealogist at the firm. Gillis worked alongside former colleague Alison Peacock on the research. The collaboration also involved Deborah Penton of the Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences, who coordinated the scientific side of the process, with the genealogical work being conducted by the Identifinders team. Gillis began by uploading the DNA profile developed from the exhumed remains to genealogical databases, where individuals voluntarily submit their own genetic information to explore family connections and ancestry. The uploaded profile was compared against existing entries to identify individuals who shared segments of DNA with the unknown male victim. Shared DNA segments indicated a biological relationship, even if that relationship was distant, such as a second or third cousin several generations removed from a common ancestor. The genetic matches produced by the database comparison gave Gillis starting points for building family trees. Using traditional genealogical research methods alongside the DNA data, she traced lineages through historical records, including birth certificates, marriage records, census data, and other publicly available documentation. The process involved constructing family trees for multiple DNA matches simultaneously, working backward to identify shared ancestors, and then forward again to map out all descendants of those ancestors. Gillis identified the male victim as Harold Dean Clouse Jr. within 10 days of taking the case. The speed of the identification reflected both the quality of the DNA extracted from the remains and the genealogical matches available in the database at the time of the search. Once Harold was identified, the process of identifying the female victim became significantly more straightforward. When Gillis shared the identification of Harold with his family members, they provided information about his wife, Tina Gail Lynn Clouse. That family connection allowed investigators to confirm the identity of the second victim as Tina. The identification of both victims was confirmed through the coordination of genetic evidence, genealogical research, and family verification. The two people who had been buried as John Doe and Jane Doe in Harris County for 40 years were formally identified as Harold Dean Clouse Jr., age 21 at the time of his death, and Tina Gail Lynn Clouse, age 17 at the time of her death. Both had been killed in December 1980 or early January 1981. The Clouse and Lynn families received the confirmation of what had happened to Harold and Tina. Donna Casasanta, Holly's grandmother, expressed gratitude toward the investigators who would work to find answers. The families had spent 4 decades without knowing the fate of the young couple, and the identification provided a factual foundation for understanding what had occurred, even as the question of who was responsible for the murders remained completely unresolved. Texas authorities, now equipped with confirmed identities for both victims, were able to formally reopen the murder investigation with a foundation that had never previously existed. The case that had been suspended for 4 decades due to the inability to identify the victims could now be approached as the investigation it had always been, with names, family connections, and a documented timeline that could be examined for leads. The identification also made it possible to begin searching for Holly Marie Clouse, whose fate had remained entirely unknown since she was left at an Arizona church as an infant, decades earlier. With Harold and Tina formally identified in 2021, investigators turned their attention to the question that had remained open since the bodies were first discovered in 1981. Baby Holly Marie Clouse had not been found near her parents, had not appeared in any missing persons system under her own name, and had grown up somewhere in the United States without knowing who her biological parents were. The task of locating her required working backward from the circumstances of her separation, beginning with the account of 2 women leaving an infant at a church in Arizona. Investigators followed the documented details of Holly's known history, the account of the women in white robes dropping an infant at an Arizona church provided a geographic starting point. The family that had raised Holly was identified through records connected to that church placement. Texas authorities confirmed that the family who raised Holly had no involvement in the deaths of Harold and Tina, and were not considered suspects at any point in the investigation. Once investigators located the family, they were able to make contact with Holly directly. By the time she was found, Holly was 42 years old. She had lived her entire life without knowing the identities of her biological parents or understanding the circumstances under which she had been separated from them as an infant. The notification that her biological parents had been identified and that they had been murdered in Texas in 1980 represented information of a magnitude that fundamentally changed her understanding of her own history. Holly was informed of the identities of Harold Dean Clouse Jr. and Tina Gail Lynn Clouse. She was told about the investigation, the identification process, and the decades that had passed since her parents were killed. The extended biological families of both Harold and Tina were notified of her location. Donna Casasanta, Holly's grandmother on her mother's side, had spent decades hoping that Holly would be found alive and in good health. The confirmation that Holly had survived and been raised in a stable environment brought an end to one dimension of the uncertainty the family had carried for 40 years. The Texas Attorney General's office announced publicly on June 9, 2022, that baby Holly had been located alive and well. First Assistant Attorney General Brent Webster addressed reporters, providing details about how Holly had been found and confirming that she had been in contact with her extended biological family. Webster stated that the family hoped to meet Holly in person. The announcement drew national media attention as the resolution of a decades-old mystery involving not just a double murder but the fate of an infant who had been separated from her family and raised under entirely different circumstances. Holly's location as an adult was in Cushing, Oklahoma. Following her identification and the public announcement of her discovery, Holly became involved in advocacy work connected to missing persons cases. She began working with organizations focused on identifying missing individuals, using her own provided the Clouse and Lynn families with confirmation that at least one part of the tragedy that had begun in 1980 had a different outcome than feared. Holly had not been harmed. She had been raised and had built a life. The families who had spent 40 years without knowing what had become of her could now move forward with the knowledge that she was alive. The murder investigation, however, remained entirely open. The identification of Harold and Tina and the location of Holly answered the questions of who the victims were and what had happened to their daughter. The question of who killed Harold and Tina in December 1980 or early January 1981 and left their bodies in a wooded area outside Houston had no answer. No suspect had been identified, no arrest had been made, and the nomadic religious group connected to the family's disappearance had never been formally identified by name or organizational structure. The identification of Harold and Tina Clouse and the location of Holly resolved the questions that forensic genealogy was designed to answer. What it could not resolve was the criminal investigation itself. As of the time of the public announcement in June 2022, no suspect had been identified in the murders of Harold Dean Clouse Jr. and Tina Gail Lynn Clouse. No arrests had been made. No charges had been filed. The two people killed in December 1980 or early January 1981 and left in a wooded area outside Houston had been identified after 40 years, but the person or persons responsible for their deaths remained unknown. The nomadic religious group described by Sister Susan, by the women at Daytona, and by the women who dropped Holly at the Arizona church was never formally identified by name. Texas authorities noted the group had been observed across multiple states, including Arizona, California, and possibly Texas, but no organizational records, no leadership structure, and no confirmed membership list was ever produced. The group operated without the kind of institutional presence that would leave a traceable documentary record, and the decades that passed before the investigation was formally reopened made the task of identifying them significantly harder. The missing police report from the Daytona International Speedway meeting represented a concrete gap in the available evidence. Officers were reportedly present when the women in robes returned the AMC Concorde to the Clouse family, and the women were reportedly taken into custody at that time. If a report had been filed, it would have contained names, descriptions, and potentially identifying information about the individuals connected to the religious group. Texas investigators confirmed they were still searching for that document, acknowledging that records from 1981 were frequently incomplete or lost over time. The 40-year gap between the murders and the identification of the victims illustrated a structural problem in how unidentified remains cases were handled across jurisdictions in the United States. A family searching in Florida had no reliable mechanism for connecting their missing relatives to unidentified remains in a Texas county database. The fragmentation of missing persons records across state and county lines meant that cases like this one could remain suspended indefinitely, not because investigators failed to do their jobs within their own systems, but because the systems themselves were not designed to communicate with each other effectively. The involvement of a private funding source, AudioChuck, in financing the genealogical work that identified Harold and Tina Clouse raised questions about the reliance on external resources to resolve cases that fell within the responsibility of public institutions. The identification was achieved because a private organization chose to fund it. The broader question of how many similar cases remained unresolved due to the absence of such funding was one that the outcome of this case made difficult to ignore. Holly Marie Clouse, having learned her biological identity and made contact with her extended family, channeled her experience into advocacy work. She became involved with organizations focused on identifying missing persons, contributing to efforts that sought to prevent other families from enduring the kind of decades-long uncertainty that the Clouse and Lynn families had experienced. Her work represented a practical application of lessons drawn directly from her own history. The Texas Attorney General's Cold Case and Missing Persons Unit continues to investigate the murders of Harold Dean Clouse Jr. and Tina Gail Lynn Clouse. The case remains active, and prosecutors have stated publicly that they hope new attention on the case will produce information that has not previously come forward. 40 years passed before the victims were identified. The investigation now has names, a documented timeline, and a public profile that it did not have for most of those decades. If you have any information about the murders of Harold Dean Clouse Jr. and Tina Gail Lynn Clouse, or about the nomadic religious group connected to their disappearance, contact the Texas Attorney General's Cold Case and Missing Persons Unit. Any detail, regardless of how much time has passed, may be relevant to investigators still working to find answers for this family.